One of the creepiest legends told by 19th century prospectors described an 8-foot skeleton that marched randomly across the California desert, seeking its treasure with a phantom light. Today on American Strangeness, the giant skeleton ghost of the Borrego Badlands. It's Halloween, or perhaps a few days before when you're not expecting such a fright. You stroll familiar neighborhood streets, sunset-toned leaves crunching under your shoes as daylight dims into murkiness around you. You breeze by a hedgerow, turn a blind corner, and standing there in the manicured front yard of a neighbor's house looming is a skeleton twice your height. Eyes vacant, it reaches for you, striding forward on legs like telephone poles, intent on dragging you screaming beneath a chipper layer of sod. For the past several Halloweens, a creepy new yard decoration has become all the rage. Giant skeletons, some as tall as 12 feet, and sold at your friendly local Home Depot. What few homeowners might realize when happily setting up their seasonal display is that the enormous undead skeleton protecting their property from trick-or-treaters echoes a genuine legend from the American West, dating back to the decades following the gold rush in California's forbidding Colorado desert. When Philip A. Bailey penned Golden Mirages in 1940, he based his collection of lost treasure lore and tall tales on a wealth of historical texts, and crucially on conversations with old prospectors who lived that already fabled history. These were the stories they whispered around campfires before yet another day of enduring the elements, a glistening gold or silver lode just one pickaxe strike below the surface. Among Bailey's collected folklore is the spine-tingling tale of an 8-foot-tall skeleton that stalks the Borrego Badlands in Southern California. Even today, the Borrego Badlands are a surreal and desolate experience. They encompass a 20-mile-wide, 15-mile-long stretch of Anza Borrego Desert State Park, California's largest state park. Per the tourism site Visit California, the Badlands are a maze of golden hills and sand-colored arroyos, sunrise and sunset casting bold shadows across the creased and wrinkled ridges. While the landscape is arid and parched in this epoch, it was once the floor of a marine environment, submerged beneath a swirl of salt water from the Gulf of California and fresh water from the Colorado River. Fossilized seashells can be found on the desert surface. Imagine the alien terrain of the Borrego Badlands a century and a half ago, when it was even more remote, quiet, and dangerous, and you can place yourself in the boots of Charlie, Arizona, on the night he first encountered a skeletal apparition. Charlie, Arizona, or some variation, was a somewhat common nickname during the late 19th century in the Old West. There was a renowned Arizona Charlie Meadows who once performed riding and shooting feats as the king of cowboys in his own Wild West show. But this Arizona Charlie, by one account Charles Kuntz, was a grizzled and dedicated prospector. Sometime during the 1880s, Charlie had embarked on a 6-week prospecting trip between Yuma, Arizona and San Diego. On this occasion, he was camped for the night about 4 miles southeast of Borrego, between the 17 Palms Oasis and Superstition Mountain. Something spooked Charlie's burros in the middle of the night, and he got up to quiet them. It was then, through the darkness and about 200 yards east of where he stood, that Charlie saw an enormous skeleton. It was at least 8 feet tall and walked crazily as though unable or too indifferent to hold a course, wrote Bailey. The skeleton had a light in its chest, like a lantern flickering through its ribcage. Within moments, the skeleton scaled a ridge and vanished from Charlie's sight. The old prospector insisted it was no dream. Over the next few years, additional witnesses would prove him right. 2 prospectors camped in the Superstition Hills one night were startled by a flickering light that passed by in the distance and moved out of sight. While they rationalized it must have been their campfire reflecting off a rock, One of the men revealed he had seen a skeleton carrying a lantern. Several months later, the pair of prospectors were in the mining town of Vallecito, California, when one of their fellows arrived telling of his encounter with a wandering stack of bones. He also described the skeleton carrying a light, or possibly having a light within itself. He said the figure was wandering around aimlessly, like a mother cow looking for her lost calf. As stories about the giant skeleton circulated, 2 different men set out into the Badlands specifically to find it. On the 3rd night of their search, they finally encountered the 8-foot skeleton, light emanating from its ribs as it zigzagged across their path. The men gave chase over the rough terrain. One fired off a shot with his rifle, which either missed or had no effect. Trailing the skeleton as it headed in the general direction of Fish Mountain, presumably in the Fish Creek Mountains, the men observed that sometimes it would gallop up a hill with remarkable energy and then stop and putter around, walking in circles as though undecided what to do. Then it would stalk majestically down the hill and across the plain, only to end up in some canyon busily tramping around. The men lost sight of the skeleton after about 3 miles. Sightings of the skeleton continued fleetingly, although usually as a friend of a friend tale. In one story deemed more reliable, a Texan who was camped at the foot of Red Mountain heard rattling and saw a glow that moved like fence pickets walking in a row. It sank behind a ridge less than 200 feet away, but the Texan didn't witness the giant skeleton itself. Prospectors developed a theory that the skeleton belonged to the man who had developed, worked, and now searched in death for the lost phantom mine. As Bailey cryptically described it, the mine is known to exist, and its exact location is common knowledge, but for some inexplicable reason no one can find it. Another proposed identity for the preoccupied ghost was Thomas Pegleg Smith, whose infamous lost gold mine drove many treasure hunters to their demise in the parched desert sands. There is another tradition in the Borrego region about a ball of light that drifts across the desert as if looking for a place to land. The phenomenon is most often associated with Squaw Peak, a low-lying hill 3 miles north of Osatillo Wells. One old tale recalls a deputy sheriff who set out after the roving light, certain that it was the product of human pranksters. When he found the light and it failed to obey his command to halt, the officer opened fire. The next day, all he could find were the impressions where his bullet had struck the ground. Unsurprisingly, the mysterious ball of light is often associated with the massive skeleton, with some storytellers claiming that they are one and the same. It brings to mind accounts of ghost lights from around the world, such as Will-o'-the-Wisp, possibly a product of organic decay in swampland, and the Marfa lights in Texas, attributed by some to causes such as car headlights and atmospheric mirages. One explanation for the ghost lights spotted around the western edge of Anza Borrego Desert State Park is the friction of sand blown against bare desert mountains, which may at times generate enough static electricity to cause visible discharges at night, reported Vincent H. Gaddis in his 1967 book, Mysterious Fires and Lights. The late 19th century and early 20th century American press was unopposed to fantastic tales that grabbed reader interest. One year it was sea serpents, another year it was mystery airships, and for a period it was tales of people digging up ancient graves containing giant corpses. In one example from 1870, the Philadelphia Inquirer carried a dispatch from Wisconsin about bricklayers who uncovered a 13-foot-tall human skeleton while sinking the foundation for a barn. Of course, there is a huge difference between giant skeletons dead in the soil and those walking like confused robots across the desert. The Borrego Badlands skeleton does have some contemporary relatives from other locales, however. In a catalog of local ghost sightings in an 1889 issue of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, a St. Charles, Missouri woman recalled a frightening childhood incident that happened during a moonlight night on her family farm. She had crossed the yard to call the men in for supper when she was suddenly confronted by a giant skeleton dressed in white. The phantom threw out its long arms with its immense claw-like fingers and dove at the girl. She turned aside and made several attempts to run past the large ghost, but it always managed to appear in front of her. Finally, she dashed back against the house and fainted, where farmhands found her unharmed but shaken. Others later claimed to have seen the ghost. In the very same Post-Dispatch article, several witnesses from Alton, Illinois, reported a specter near St. Mary's Church at the corner of 3rd and Henry Streets in August 1882. The ghost appeared as a skeleton illuminated by phosphorescent light shining from within its ghastly proportions. The skeleton always appeared immediately after the church chimes pealed forth the hour of midnight. In a third tale from the Post-Dispatch, Judge Reuben Davis of Marshall, Missouri, was horrified one night when a chilly hand was placed upon his shoulder. He spun around to confront a skeleton with fiery eyes and blue fire shining through its ribs. A man of great strength, Davis clasped the grisly horror in his arms and squeezed, the pressure fracturing every bone in the skeleton's body with a terrible grinding noise. He awoke to find that, in his dream, he had shattered a life-size cast of the Venus de Medici that stood in his bedroom. The statue had somehow leaned forward across the judge's bed and, quote, touched him in a sensitive spot. Enormous skeleton phantoms are not confined to land, however. Sailors crossing the world's oceans in the 18th century were said to reserve their greatest fear for the manifestation of a huge ship, shaped like a Spanish galleon or caravel, and manned by giant human skeletons and monster dogs. The skeletons were wretches who committed desperate crimes in life, and the dogs were demons assigned to guard and gnaw at them. It was said that if you had the misfortune to encounter this vessel, all your crew would disappear. That fate was thankfully easy to avoid, as orders were delivered on the ghost ship via large conch shells, a sound that could be heard from several miles away. Several Ave Marias and appeals to saints couldn't hurt either. When you inevitably stumble across those towering decorative skeletons this Halloween season, think back to the bone-dry, mysteriously glowing revenants stalking the Borrego Badlands, and be glad you were not there, blocking the path between its eternal greed and long-forgotten treasure. If I ever purchase one of those giant skeletons for my yard, I'll promise you this: I'm hanging a lantern in its ribcage.